Molt bé, doncs donem inici a aquesta nova conferència del cicle d'arxius, investigació i patrimoni científic, una mirada des de la història de les ciències, que és un cicle que estem organitzant des d'ací, des de l'Institut Interuniversitari López Piñero i també en col·laboració amb la Societat Catalana d'Història de la Ciència i la Tècnica i que estem impulsant Francesca Antonelli, Luz Narbona i jo mateix, que soc Ximo Guillem. Bé, el cicle és un cicle en el que estem reflexionant sobre l'arxiu, que estem reflexionant sobre què són aquests arxius, com es construeixen, quin rol van a tenir diferents agents en la seva construcció, en l'establiment d'aquests arxius, bibliotecaris, arxivers, investigadors, investigadores, que ens fa reflexionar també sobre com aquests arxius condicionen la nostra investigació i que ens fan també, i volem també reflexionar sobre com interactuen arxius i museus, patrimoni instrumental, documental, bibliogràfic, fonts orals, etc. Bé, en aquest cicle en aquest cicle hem tingut primer una conferència de Marco Beretta que ens va parlar sobre l'arxiu versus museu, consideracions preliminars sobre les fonts en història de la ciència. Tindrem la setmana que ve Miren Jona, que és de la Universitat del País Basc, i que presentarà un seminari que porta per títol El archivo de fuentes orales, un puente entre la memoria de las mujeres y la historia de género. I avui tenim la conferència de Mike Jones, que ara introduirà Luz Narbona, i que en principi s'havia de celebrar al novembre, a l'inici del novembre, però que no podrem celebrar en aquell moment perquè, com possiblement sabeu tots vosaltres, no, tinguérem aquest episodi de la Dana sumat a la incompetència del govern valencià, generant una situació absolutament catastròfica i que va dur a que la universitat deixarà les seues activitats durant un parell de setmanes, incloent, clar, aquest seminari que teníem previst per dins d'aixòs dies. No? Bé, ara el recuperem i podrem tenir aquest seminari i dir-vos també que aquesta és una línia de treball que no tancarem amb aquest cicle de seminaris, sinó que també estem organitzant ja, i en breu podrem anunciar, una jornada per continuar reflexionant sobre l'arxiu, una jornada que tindrà lloc el 24 de gener, i després encara continuarem amb altres activitats, perquè és una línia de treball que volem continuar i que serà central en la nostra activitat els propers anys. Per tant, doncs, anirem anunciant altres activitats, començant per aquesta del 24 de gener en breu. Bé, doncs, dono la paraula a...
¿No?
Com vulguis, no cal. A Luz.
Hola, buenas tardes, buenos días. El doctor Mike Jones les voy a presentar a Mike Jones. El doctor Mike Jones es archivero, historiador y consultor de colecciones con más de 15 años de experiencia trabajando en el sector GLAM, que quiere decir, por sus siglas en inglés, galerías, bibliotecas, archivos y museos, en proyectos digitales, archivísticos y de historia pública. La investigación interdisciplinar de Mike explora la historia de los archivos y museos y la forma en que se documenta, gestiona, exhibe y accede al conocimiento basado en colecciones. En la actualidad es becario postdoctoral de Historia Indígena y Colonial en la Universidad de Tasmania y participa en varios proyectos de colaboración con comunidades de las primeras naciones, profesionales de museos, archiveros y académicos. Su primer libro, Artefacts, Archives and Documentation in the Relational Museum, fue publicado por Routledge en el 2021. It's a pleasure having with us, and if you want, you can start.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I appreciate it. And I feel like I should be able to respond in Spanish, but unfortunately I can't. So I'll be presenting in English, but I'll try and speak clearly, and hopefully everyone can follow on okay. I'm sure your English is much better than my Spanish is. I'll just get my presentation started. Just confirming you can see those slides okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Just to introduce myself, my name is Dr. Mike Jones, and I'm a non-Indigenous academic who works as an archivist and a historian and a postdoctoral fellow of Indigenous and colonial histories at the University of Tasmania. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I wanted to start with this map and an acknowledgement that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So the country that I'm speaking to you from is here. I work for the University of Tasmania, which is on that island just below the red circle, but I live in Naarm, or Melbourne. And I live in a place called Merri-bek, which means rocky country in the Wurundjeri Wurrung language. And it was recently renamed Merri-bek because for nearly 200 years it was called Moreland, and Moreland was the name of a Jamaican slave plantation, and this area had been named after a Jamaican slave plantation by one of the land speculators who came to Australia, because that plantation was run by his father and a grandfather. An example of how colonialism has impacted on the naming of these landscapes. But this is also relevant to what I want to talk about today, this sort of context. It's relevant to the collecting history of Australia, because from the earliest encounters with Europeans, people have taken and bought and stolen countless artifacts and specimens and people from across these lands, and have captured and recorded cultural knowledge and language and other information from across the continent now called Australia. And this material is stored in archives across Australia and around the world, and in museum collections and libraries. It's a distributed collection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history that's taken and managed by colonial institutions, largely within colonial and Western knowledge structures. Often this happened with little or no explicit links between what was collected and this complex multicultural landscape that you see here. So this is more than 250 nations and as many languages, as many as 800 dialects. So in this paper, I want to explore museums and their archives and the ways in which these processes have separated and split material in unhelpful ways from other pieces of related knowledge and from landscapes and communities like this. And some of the work that's happening to change the way these institutions think and work. And there's going to be a recurring focus throughout, because it's a theme of my own work, not just on the connections between archives and museum collections, but also on the value of effectively documenting and making that knowledge accessible to users and researchers and others in more useful ways. And although it's exploring the idea of science archives broadly, I think there's many interesting implications for other disciplines and other areas as well that we can perhaps pick up in the discussion. But this kind of landscape and all of these communities is also here as a reminder that when you see lists like this in museums, and this list is from the British Museum, that these terms in themselves are already separating these things off from the cultural knowledge that they're associated with. Terms like Aboriginal Australian or Indigenous Australian, or the names of states that are the names of the states imposed on the continent, strip this material away from this cultural knowledge and this cultural landscape and the communities that were shown in the previous map. So just doing a quick bit of history that I'm sure many of you will already know, but despite the limitations of these collecting institutions, people have looked at collections and collecting for a long time as a valuable way of gaining knowledge and understanding about the world. And this has always included archives and documentation in relationship with many other sorts of collections. Initially, this was a personal pursuit. This is Francis Bacon's writing at the end of the 16th century, and he listed the requirements for a modern scholar. That included a library, including printed and manuscript material, a wonderful garden, collections of animals, birds and fish, a cabinet of artifacts, and a laboratory. These writings were some of the foundational texts for the Enlightenment, which through the 17th and 18th centuries focused on experimentation, observation, the uncovering of supposedly objective and universal truths about the world. But these sort of Enlightenment ideas were also inextricably woven through with racist tropes about noble savages, and they led powerful nations to mount expeditions around the globe, including Captain Cook's Pacific voyage on the HMS Endeavour that took him to the east coast of Australia and contributed to ongoing colonial expansion. Other institutions continue this kind of idea of interconnected knowledge. This is the text that's carved into the facade of what's now the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. And this idea from James Smithson, that the Smithsonian is named after, being aware that knowledge shouldn't be viewed in isolated parts, but as a whole, each portion of which throws light on the other. And George Brown Good, also from the Smithsonian in the 1880s, talked about setting aside the past idea of the museum that's a kind of cemetery of bric-a-brac, and creating a nursery of living thoughts, something that stands side by side with the library and the laboratory, links with universities and colleges, cooperates with public libraries, and acts as one of the principal agencies for the enlightenment of the people. This is also familiar here in Australia and here in Melbourne, where I have lived and worked for much of my life. This is Frederick McCoy, who was born in Dublin, likely in about 1817, but there's some debate about that. He moved to Australia in 1854, and he became one of the first 4 professors at the University of Melbourne. He was an explicit devotee of Bacon's ideas. He collected a scholarly library. He developed the museum that you see in the photograph here. This was purpose-built on the campus of the University of Melbourne to form the National Museum of Victoria. He taught subjects like chemistry, zoology, botany, mineralogy, and he started a system garden on campus that's still there to this day, actually just next to the building that I completed my PhD in some years back. So this is, again, the idea of interconnected knowledge and collections and the need for all these different sorts of collections to start understanding things about the world. But there's another side to this kind of interconnected cross-disciplinary view of knowledge, and that's the equivalent tendency to categorize things, to classify things, to break things up into hierarchies and linear structures. Think about higher and lower orders of plants or animals or people or cultures. And that sort of approach can also lead to racist displays like this that was in the American Museum of Natural History and was there until 1961. And this is a tree of man among the primates, showing an Australian Aboriginal person here on one of the lower branches beneath people from Europe, Asia, and the Americas. There's also a slightly ridiculous side sometimes to these systems that split things off from other sorts of collections and from other sorts of knowledge. This is the computer that was in the Science Museum in London and was listed like this for many years online, which uses a taxonomic structure, this sort of tree structure, to say that it's furnishing and equipment and tools and equipment and computer. But there's a sticker on there that says, don't turn this computer off because it's operating as a server. This was actually Tim Berners-Lee's computer that ran the first internet server in the first days of the internet. And that kind of social context and that history of technology is missing from these classification structures that puts things into kind of buckets and categories. It was there in the description for this, but if you're searching by categories and classification, you wouldn't know the social and cultural impact of a computer like this. So drawing on Foucault's ideas, this is the idea of tables or thought operating upon the entities of the world. It's carving them up, it's dividing them into classes, and it's using language to intersect space. In the same way, actually, that I was talking about language naming country earlier on, and the way that that intersects and divides up space, sometimes in problematic ways. This has also been seen as a problem in museums for quite a long time, for nearly as long as modern museums have been around. This is Birmingham bookseller and historian William Hutton, who in 1784 went to London to visit the British Museum, or he visited the British Museum while he was in London. It was at Montague House at that stage, and they had very small groups of people going through. There were about 10 people waiting outside when Hutton arrived, a lot less than a British Museum these days. There was a tour going through, a small group that was hurried through the institution. And Hutton became really frustrated and asked the guide if they would be told what they were looking at and the knowledge about these items. And the guide got frustrated with Hutton in return and said, "What, would you have me tell you everything in the museum?" So the names are written upon many of them. And Hutton wrote afterwards that the history and the object need to go together for this to be a meaningful experience. If one is wanting, the other's of little value. And he says, it grieved me to think how much I lost for want of a little information. In about 30 minutes, we finished our silent journey through this princely mansion, which could well have taken 30 days. I went out about as wise as I went in. So other places dealing with this kind of issue, like the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, they received similar complaints in the late 19th century. And so as Annie E. Coombs writes, they added sketches, photographs, maps, and diagrams into the displays in order to increase the educational value of the series exhibited and in order to explain the nature of the exhibited specimens to a more general public. So that demand for information came from the museum's visitors themselves, and they were criticizing the institution for the overdependence on the presence of an expert to render things meaningful. They wanted to be able to do some of that work themselves. Which brings us to a key point about museum specimens and objects and artifacts, and in some cases, artworks, that aside from their formal or material qualities, when they're presented or stored without their context, their significance or their meaning or their value, both monetary value and their value as objects, is difficult or even impossible to determine. The new museologists, so in new museology, people talked about these objects as being mute, they're not being able to speak. Or archaeologist Flinders Petrie, who put it more colourfully in 1904, he called museums ghastly charnel houses of murdered evidence. The dry bones of objects are there, bare of all the facts of grouping, locality, and dating, which would give them historical life and value. So where this information does exist, it's stored in many places. It's in catalogues and databases. It's in the heads of curators sometimes. It's in archives and records, and most notably in archives and records. It's in correspondence. It's in donor records. It's in field books. It's in curatorial files. It's in conservation notes. It's in documents that are acquired or produced as part of the business of collecting artifacts, preserving them, storing them, and working with them as part of research or as part of exhibitions development. So as we're talking about museum archives here, I just want to do a whirlwind tour of some of the kind of chronology of museum archives, because museum archives as a kind of specialist field actually developed quite late in the history of museums, at least in the English-speaking world. And there is a bias here towards the English-speaking world, which is where most of my research has been based. So this is mostly based on America, the UK, or England, and Australia. But the Smithsonian was one of the really early institutions to employ someone in charge of archives in a museum. And they did that in 1890. That's kind of before the archival profession, as it's currently kind of characterized, really got up and running itself. So that is an early example. And before even the American Association of Museums was founded, so the kind of professionalization of museums. Then just a year after the formation of the Association of Museums in the United States, the conference included a session on museum records. The discussion of museum archives and the value of these records was part of conversations about museums from the earliest kind of days of professionalization in the early 20th century. It was in the 30s that the Society of American Archivists was founded, and the Society of Archivists in the UK wasn't formed till the 50s. As we'll see on the next slide, in Australia, it took until the 70s. So there was a kind of 40-year period where professionalization was really increasing in archives. Archivists were starting to produce their own journals, create societies, create training in universities. In museums, there still weren't formal archival programs running at this stage. The Cleveland Museum of Art created a records schedule in 1956, but they didn't have an archivist to implement it. So it just kind of sat there as a document, and they didn't really use it to control the records that are in there. There's also been public record acts and things like that, so legislation that's affected the way this material's been managed. In the 60s, the Tate Gallery set up an archive to collect material about British art and artists, which was one of the early kind of big gallery archives in the English-speaking world. As I said, in the 70s, the Australian Society of Archivists was founded. And then in the rest of the 70s, second half of the 70s, there were a few kind of key developments here. The two that are shown in grey are broader museum history. So there was a court case in the United States called Lefkowitz versus the Museum of the American Indian Hay Foundation, where a court found that museums as public institutions had a duty to make knowledge about their collections available to the public because they held that material in trust for the broader public, which meant that the material needed to be registered, it needed to be documented, it needed to be available in some form or another. And around the same time, registrars and others working in collections documentation were becoming more and more professionalized within the museums sector. So in the late 70s, archivists started to turn their attention to museums and realized the wealth of documentary heritage that existed in museums and started to work with museums to try and get control of that. In 1978, in the United States, there was the first grant awarded to a museum to establish an archival program from the Historical Publications and Records Commission that had been around for some time. And then in 1979, there was a first conference on museum archives hosted by the Archives of American Art. And these are some findings from that conference, which are familiar in other institutions that I've been to in Australia and in the UK and other places. Firstly, the type of records we find in a museum, just to confirm that, kind of fall into three main categories. There are institutional records, in particular those that relate to the administration of the institution, so the standard things like meeting minutes, financial papers. There are documents about staffing and upkeep of buildings and all of those sort of things that a large institution would keep as part of their records. There are acquired records as well, so kind of collected papers that come in with collections material, or there might be the papers of artists. They might be field books that come in from anthropologists or from natural scientists. Museum benefactors might donate papers to the institution or trustees. And there are records relating to objects within the collection that start to capture these stories, curatorial research done as part of exhibitions development, those sorts of things. Quite often held for long periods of time in curatorial files that related to particular objects in the collection. And the Conference on Museum Archives held in the US was quite specific on this. They stated that the archives should be essentially a separate department within the institution. It should have custodial authority delegated by the museum's director. And physically, it should be located in a separate and secure area of the museum. So what this resulted in many cases, was archival programs being set up that started to extract documents from different departments and different parts of the institution into a kind of centralized archive at department level or at institutional level, and started to create separation between this material because it was managed separately in different areas using different types of approaches to the collections material that it related to. So I created archives that look like this. This is the Victoria and Albert archives as they were in 2016. I think they've moved since then. But stored separately, boxed up, and catalogued and classified as an archival collection, not necessarily with direct reference to any of the other collections material. There are also, there are also different systems and standards and ways of describing these collections, different documentation systems, different databases, which I won't go into in detail, but you might have EMU or TMS to document your artifacts and your collections in a museum, whereas you might have Records Manager or Archivist Toolkit or Atom or other tools to document your archival collections using different standards and different approaches. And on big museum websites, you see these sorts of splits appearing in the site that reflect these splits that exist in the institution. There are many instances where you need to search the collection, which are the artifacts or the specimens, or search the library and archives, but these two things are separate because they're run out of separate systems. Or there are instances where there's an aggregated search, so you can search across both, but as soon as you click on an item, you end up heading into either the archival catalogue or the artifact catalogue. And there's very little kind of sideways relationships between these things. And it results in essentially decontextualized objects and artifacts in an institution. So this is a hammerstone, a stone tool that was collected in Tasmania in the early 20th century by the Reverend Christopher George Wilkinson, and is now in the British Museum. Wilkinson was an amateur collector. He was one of a big network of amateur and sort of semi-professional collectors that collected material and sent them back to places like the British Museum. And they often sent correspondence or had correspondence with the museum as part of this approach. So in April 1901, he'd packaged up 26 stone tools for the museum, sent them back, and he wrote a letter that he sent separately. The letter that he sent separately was over 1,200 words, so 1,250 words or so. It described his collecting expeditions, where he'd been on the coast, what he saw while he was there. It analyzed marks on these stone tools. It compared them to other scholars and other artifacts in other collections, and talked about how they were transferred across to London. Charles Reed, who was a renowned curator and the keeper of British and medieval antiquities and ethnography at the British Museum, wrote back to him and he said, "I'm greatly indebted to you for your long letter of the 18th of April, which has interested me very much. I hope to receive in a short time the box of implements, when I'll examine them with your letter at hand and write you what I think." So Reed appreciated the importance of viewing the stones with the letter and the need to see the two things together. But there's no mention in the catalogue that this letter exists. It's in a bound book of correspondence. It sits, in fact, in a separate department of the museum because of restructures that happened. The stones now sit in a separate department from the department that holds the archives that relate to that material. The archives are not themselves documented in any particular detail, and despite the fact that both myself and the historian Reby Taylor have both been there at different times looking at the letter, we've talked to people at the museum about it, they know that the letter is there and they know this history. This hasn't been added to the collection knowledge that's here, and so everyone who goes back has to do the same bit of work, re-find this letter and retrace these steps. This isn't particular to the British Museum. This is widespread across many institutions. And when stuff or when things get separated from their context like this, it can lead to, when they can become completely separated in an untraceable way, it can lead to not only long sort of scholarly debates, but also to sometimes some quite acrimonious debates, claims for repatriation, rejection of repatriation requests, those sorts of things. Just a quick example of that also from the British Museum is an item called the Guagle Shield. It won't come up if you search for Guagle Shield in the British Museum catalogue. It will tell you that there are no results. Again, thinking about colonial knowledge structures here, if you search for Cook, as in Captain Cook, Banks, as in Joseph Banks, the naturalist, and Shield, it will come up under Cook, Banks, and Shield. And it's a wooden shield, undecorated. It's listed as made by Aboriginal Australian. Again, we have that very generalized term that doesn't connect it to any particular community or part of the country. It does say made perhaps in New South Wales, but there are many communities in New South Wales, and found and acquired in Botany Bay, the European name. We know what area, if this is associated with Cook and Banks, we know what area this came from. It's from the Guagle people, and actually we know who held this shield. It was a warrior named Kuman. People have talked about this as possibly that shield that came from one of these first encounters between the British and Aboriginal people on the New South Wales coast. But this now says that it was thought to have been obtained on that voyage, but then more recent scholarship argues that it's not that shield that's depicted there. And therefore, some of that information about the Guagle people and about Kuman and others that used to be in this description seems to have largely disappeared. And that information is not listed as part of any of the associated names here. It's not mentioned as part of the associated places. And yet the associations with Cook, Banks, the HMS Endeavour remain in this catalogue. The lack of kind of archival material related to this, the lack of evidence and documentation around an item like this, means that the proof of where this came from and where it's connected to has largely disappeared. And the colonial associations have been retained, and all of the community and cultural associations have essentially disappeared from the system. I'm going to give one more kind of main example here, and this is an item that has lots of material associated with it, kind of going to the other end of the scale. And it's a harpoon rope with wooden harpoon heads attached, a rope wound from hibiscus fibre that was collected from Cape York Peninsula, which is in the north of Australia. So it's up here on the eastern side of Australia, the large peninsula on the top of the state now called Queensland, and it's up in that area shown in the red circle there. and in particular from this place, which is now called Princess Charlotte Bay, but it's an area of reefs and seagrass meadows, a really interesting landscape. And the people from this area, including the Kukuyao people, hunted for dugongs in this water. They made these harpoon ropes. They put the harpoon in the end of a shaft, went out on a canoe, and would jump off the end of the canoe and harpoon a dugong. Dugong is like a manatee, a sea mammal. And then the dugong would tire out because it was pulling the rope behind it that was connected to the hunter's canoe. And then they would wait till the animal tired and then subdue it and kill it and use it for food and as well as part of ceremony and other cultural practices. It was collected by one of the most well-known ethnographers in Australia, Donald Thompson, who was active from the late 1920s. He started out as a natural scientist, as a biologist, but then was trained in anthropology and did expeditions to Cape York Peninsula in the late 1920s. He collected other material from up here, other harpoons. He collected natural history specimens. So this is a dugong skull that sits in the Melbourne Museum store, and the tag that's on it is in Donald Thompson's handwriting. He kept copious amounts of field notes, so hundreds and hundreds of pages of field notes. These field notes ended up being transcribed in the 1970s and ended up being something like 10,000 pages of accumulated field notes and other material. And his tags on specimens, for example, included other interesting information like language terms, cultural information, as well as dates, the sites that he'd found them. All this kind of knowledge that needs to be wrapped around these items so that they can be used as part of kind of meaning making or storytelling. He wrote scholarly articles about dugong hunting in the area. This is one of the main ones, and you can see an illustration of the canoe here, and that coiled bit in the top of the canoe is a harpoon rope. He wrote in the popular press as well, magazines like Walkabout, about the dugong hunters of Princess Charlotte Bay. This has been catalogued, the collection is being classified into a kind of functional system of, for example, utensils and implements and hunting and fighting material that includes harpoon equipment, including the rope and the harpoon heads that were shown earlier. And this is the entry in that microfiche catalogue. And there are digital labels about this harpoon rope, which is on display in the museum. There are digital labels that sit in front of the display that have one of Thompson's photographs of a man weaving weaving one of these harpoon ropes. The story of a being named Katara who told people how to make these ropes. And then the rope that Katara had made a great coil of this rope turned into a stone that is a rock that's still visible today in Temple Bay. And after that, Katara went away and turned into a silver gull. So there are connections with the geological landscape and with the ecology of the area through birds like silver gulls. All of this material associated with this artifact. Again, looking at some of the collections documentation around this and the limitations of it, if we look at the artifact in the online collections site, we don't get much of that context at all. We don't get the information from the digital labels that are in the exhibition space. We do get some information about language groups and location information, but there are no links, nothing that says that the natural history material is there, nothing that talks about the archival material or the photographs or any of that other context. Again, that's all left up to people to discover for themselves. All these kind of severed links between things because of these siloed management of material in institutions, in large museums. We see this from the other side as well. This is in particular to people managing artifacts. The Donald Thompson Ethno-History Collection is registered as part of the UNESCO Memory of the World program. And this talks about photographs, sound recordings and transcripts, maps, drawings, notebooks, language lists, correspondence, illustrations, etc. This is a documentary archive that's registered as part of that Memory of the World program. It doesn't mention artifacts at all. It doesn't say that this is related to one of the most significant ethnographic collections of artifacts in Australia, if not the world. It doesn't mention the natural history specimens either. It just talks about it as a purely documentary collection. And to round things off, there's also a natural history catalogue called Donald Thompson's Mammals and Fishes of Northern Australia that does talk about the notebooks and the documentary archive and the natural history specimens, but doesn't mention the artifacts. So all these different kind of disciplinary areas that carve out chunks of this material and separate it off from other parts of the collection in generally quite unhelpful ways. It's also doubly frustrating in this case because the microfiche catalogue that was printed in 1987 contains these really explicit cross-references to all this other material. It includes, so the references TFN 192 is to field notes that Thompson wrote, DTBOT 381A is to botanical specimens, the pub reference TPub 5 is to a published scholarly article, and on the one underneath, TPH references a set of amazing photographs of these harpoon heads and rope being constructed, which is a useful reminder that these sort of things are also not linear. So I'm not the first person to do this sort of work on this collection. And if it was captured in a useful way and documented well, I wouldn't need to repeat that work. I did need to repeat it. This is me on a whiteboard trying to work out how this collection fits together through the archival material, the natural history specimens, the artifacts. So it's not a linear process. That knowledge doesn't increase in these institutions and continue to build and grow so that everyone can kind of stand on everyone else's shoulders. There's progress made in some areas and then it goes backwards again, and the work has to be repeated as part of research into these archival collections. And there are some institutions that have tried to, in the past, do work to alleviate this. The Division of Anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History had an amazing online catalogue that I actually went and spoke to them about in person when I was in New York, because it was the best example of this that I'd found at that time, around about 10 years ago, where artifacts in their collection are linked to photographs, they're linked to field notes from expeditions, and you can jump straight to digitized versions of those field notes as well as transcribed versions of those field notes. There are related archival finding aids, there's a manuscript catalogue, there's an information kind of page about the expedition itself where this material was collected. You can even see the original register entry. It's all there kind of packaged around this object, and you can navigate through all these areas. The problem with this is that if you try and visit it today, you end up with a "this is unavailable" page, because that was a kind of bespoke site that was built by one person who worked in that department, who then retired. They've now tried to move the whole thing into another system, and that work is currently unavailable. I was told in 2021 that it would be going back online in a few months, and it's still not up. So the main kind of systems and approaches in museums don't support this sort of work. And the fact that one of the best examples was a bespoke version that was created by an individual to try and solve a problem shows that there's no kind of widespread, systemic or useful way for institutions to tackle this problem at scale. And I also want to note here that although I've talked a lot about databases and documentation and things as part of this presentation, that the sort of relationships we're talking about here, particularly with anthropological ethnographic collections, as they're called by many museums, aren't just about these kind of links between systems and links between technologies. It's about all sorts of different relationships and relationalities. In talking about Indigenous research methods, scholars like Sean Wilson, who's a Cree scholar, talks about truth not being something that's out there or external in that kind of enlightenment sense of truth, but reality being in the relationship that one has with the truth. So an object or a thing is not as important as one's relationship to it. That means that the meaning that comes out of artifacts in museums is not just something that can be analyzed and determined by examining the artifact or even the material around it, you need those other records and that other information around it to also understand your own relationship to that thing, your community's relationship to that thing, your relationship to the person who maybe took that thing from your community, how it ended up in an institution, all of these other aspects to objects and their kind of biographies or their life that can be traced through archival records. And there's this great quote from First Nations colleague Nathan Sentence, who now works at the Museum of Applied Arts in Sydney. And he quotes an auntie talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural objects in museums, saying museums have the sticks, we have the stories. Without the stories, museums only have sticks. So thinking about how to build and maintain those relationships with community and with story in different ways that both involve archival material but also extend beyond it. So in the last section, I just want to pick up on a few examples of how the sector is changing in a place like Australia and the initiatives that are happening here to try and tackle some of this work. Progress is very, very slow, so there's still a lot of work to do. And many of these problems haven't been solved, but there is work that is starting to happen that I think is encouraging. There are roadmaps that have been adopted by the museum and gallery sector, like this Indigenous roadmap that includes 5 elements for change. It includes reimagining representation, so rethinking about exhibitions and the way that First Nations and Indigenous cultures are represented in museums and galleries. Embedding Indigenous values into museum and gallery business, so trying to move away from colonial structures and colonial mindsets and Eurocentric foundations and ways of working. Increasing Indigenous opportunity, which is bringing more Indigenous staff into institutions, giving work to First Nations curators and First Nations artists and designers and front of house staff right across the institution, as well as management level and board level in institutions, at least is the aspiration. Two-way caretaking of cultural material where, and this includes archival material, it's not just the institution that's responsible for this, it's about caretaking for that material happening in conjunction with community, and in many cases being led by community, and connecting with Indigenous communities, including repatriation and support. So many of these ideas involve rethinking traditional colonial and disciplinary and institutional boundaries, authority structures, changing management structures, not just for museums, but also for archives and libraries and galleries, and our relationship to their contents, and thinking about what we can do with that material as part of our own research. There's some fantastic work happening for people who want to follow up more on this with colleagues and friends from the Indigenous Archives Collective, which works essentially across the GLAM sector, so across galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, but particularly libraries, archives, and museums. Everything from writing journal articles to referencing guidance and policy work to being part of national and international conversations about what's required around managing Indigenous archives in a way that supports Indigenous sovereignty and cultural authority. The conversations around repatriation are changing. They're not just conversations about ancestral remains, or the return of ancestors from museums, and not necessarily just about sacred objects. There are many institutions, or some institutions, that are starting to be more open to starting conversations with community about the return of material, including archival material. This Manchester Museum repatriation that I've written about, the director of the museum said that for her, repatriation was a gain, not a loss, because it's about building relationships. So she didn't see it as losing material from her collection. She saw it as gaining relationships with the community that the material was being returned to. So they returned things like armbands and turtle shell maps and baskets, spear throwers, and 70 shell dolls are called Dadaquaquaqua from the Nindiliaqua community that's from Groote Island, which is off the northern coast of Australia. The community revitalized culture around these shell dolls. They created a contemporary art program called the Dadaquaquaqua Project, led by women from Nindiliaqua Arts. and 2 of the artists went over as part of a delegation to Manchester for the return of this material. So staff and visitors at the museum had an opportunity to hear those voices and stories. It wasn't just about reading about this. It wasn't just about seeing objects from collections. It was about public programs where people could experience and hear from and about living and Ndili aquaculture. And that mention of relationships as an idea that that museums and archives are not necessarily just about preserving things or objects or artifacts or specimens or records. They're about managing and preserving relationships and having a degree of relational accountability, this kind of ethical idea that you need to be accountable to particular relations that you have, and in some cases be accountable to those relations rather than the material that you hold. Touching on the archive side of things, there's also increasing recognition that repatriation is about archival documents and archival knowledge held in institutions, not just about the objects related to them. This is an article by Kirsten Thorpe, Shannon Forkett, and Lauren Booker. They're all part of the Indigenous Archives Collective, as well as having worked across archives, libraries, and museums in various ways for many, many years. The repatriation requests here and the idea of repatriation is about including all the associated knowledge held by institutions. So community members in particular shouldn't have to go through the same research process that I had to go through for something like the Thompson collection. They shouldn't have to try and track down their own relationships, try and follow trails through things, do hours of archival research. They shouldn't have to stand in front of whiteboards and draw complicated diagrams to try and work out how all this stuff fits together. That kind of information, if that's in institutions, it needs to be available in a way that supports the right of those communities to have that knowledge and to have access to that knowledge held in collections, but also in archives, in museums, and more broadly. So if they ask about anything, they should be able to get the related photographs and field notes and language lists and natural history specimens and everything else associated with that material, or at least be able to be told that that stuff is in the collections as well and be offered an opportunity to hear more about it, or to visit it, or potentially to ask for it back. There's this idea from a First Nations perspective that that knowledge and histories are all connected together, that this kind of flows from. In a chapter called Writing Place, Deborah Rose Bird quotes Macmac senior traditional owner Kathy Devereaux, who says, quote, "It's like the spider, a lot of things tie in together. So when you ask one thing, you get a whole big history." Have to think about ways where we can manage this material so that when people do ask one thing, they do get that whole big history rather than just being given the one thing. And archives are a key kind of component to that. So in the last couple of minutes, just talking about some of the things that we can do here. And I'm going to borrow a few words from other people, particularly Kirsten Thorpe, who is an archivist and a Warramai woman, and now works at the University of Technology, Sydney, and has written, among other things, about the need for archival sovereignty and the need for new theories in library and archival science that draw on these kind of multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary perspectives, drawing on social science and Indigenous studies, understanding human experiences, and creating new conceptual and theoretical models that can be utilized to address recurring problems, including some of the sorts of problems I've highlighted in this presentation. And she concludes, without these changes, the profession will continue to privilege certain sections of the population over others. So these professional and disciplinary divisions that I've highlighted between archives, libraries, museums, and galleries, and between anthropology and social history and natural history, between science and the humanities, these have further divided and separated records and knowledge into silos. Colonial ways of working are further privileged as a result of these systemic issues. But when considered from an Indigenous worldview, as Sean Angeli's Penanke notes, all of the assets in a collection are interconnected, and you can't have them sitting in silos. You can't isolate them from one another because it just doesn't make sense. The collection doesn't make sense. There are also First Nations artists and poets and academics who have started to work with collected archival material in other ways. They're talking back to archives and museums and galleries. People like Narungga woman and activist poet Natalie Harkin who literally weaves copies of archival material into objects and artifacts, which explore the entanglement of her life and her family with bureaucracy and the state. She talks about it as an embodied reckoning with the state's colonial archive. Or there's Brooke Andrews' work, like Vox Beyond Tasmania, explores historical trauma, decontextualized artifacts, including a human skull, and it sits above an array of publications and documents and slides and other material. This sitting above what is in effect a representation of an anthropological archive. So in conclusion, when considering this kind of weave of collections, archives are an essential thread. Records, used here broadly to include stories and oral traditions, as well as physical records and audiovisual records, they link artifacts together. They help people stitch things into a broader context. Letters, for example, can tie objects to landscapes or collectors. Field notes can thread together artifacts and expeditions and communities and cultural practices. Museum files can help us understand about how varied items have been wound together by different disciplines and organizational structures, or by exhibition narratives. Archivist Heather McNeil talks about her role as an archivist being to protect the weave of relationships that bind records to each other and to their provenance. I think we need to look at that weave of relationships as extending beyond the archive into other spaces as well. Significantly, for the kind of modern conception of a more participatory and relational museum, the subjects of records are often invested in the same sorts of ideas. The value of archives in helping them to weave or stitch or patch together knowledge about themselves and their communities and their histories, their language, their cultural knowledge. And these records can also help communities to extract their tangible and intangible heritage from museums and other collecting institutions, to take possession of cultural knowledge, including Indigenous scientific knowledge, and revitalize that knowledge and practice in their communities and on country. So to support this, notions of weaving and connection and kinship need to go beyond just tinkering with collections descriptions to improve the user experience. It's about literally unsettling colonial models and ways of working, and it needs to be founded in an explicit recognition of the unceded sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and other First Nations and Indigenous peoples over the distributed tangible and intangible heritage held in GLAM institutions, including in their archives. In Australia, we live in a landscape where the complex entanglement, in a landscape with a growing recognition that historical and cultural and scientific knowledge is also preserved in many other ways that I've only touched on briefly in this presentation. They're in landscape and oral traditions that potentially include living stories of environmental change and sea level rise that could date back many thousands of years. And they're also in the landscape and the relationship between people and country and law, between people and the environment, between human and non-human beings, and in different sorts of records like story and performance and dance and song. So the knowledge contained in all these places is significant. These, in a way, are their own kind of archives and archives of science and culture, extending beyond the history and the objects to embodied community knowledge and all these things needing to travel together. So as we grapple with these sort of major social, political, and scientific challenges we're dealing with in the present, we can draw on institutional knowledge and collections and archives, but we also need to step outside those archives and learn from other ways of knowing and being. This is a quote from Palawa artist and museum curator Julie Goff. Shared paths linger as accessibly amidst hills and along old roadways of this island as in the texts of the library and archive. To read either well, the other's required. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike, for your talk. So now we can have time for the questions, and you are all invited to ask. You can raise your hand if you want, and we can allow you to talk. Well, you can open your microphone and talk if you want. So we start from here, or yeah. Okay. So there are many things that you were that can be discussed now here, and it's your presentation was very illuminating for the issues that we want to analyze in this seminar series, and that we will continue talking in this session that we will have in January. For the more specific case, I was thinking about, and you were referring in the end to these indigenous communities, and for us, it's something that we have not much information about it. When you were talking about the involvement of the indigenous community in these indigenous archives, could you say a bit more about how they are organized? They are all willing to involve in these kind of projects, or they have different visions in their involvement in these archives?
There's probably two answers to that, and one is in terms of the professionals involved in that space, and the other is from a community level. But from a professional level, things like the Indigenous Archives Collective have created a kind of unified vision of what needs to happen in the archives and museums and library space to help move towards more kind of control and authority over archives by Indigenous and First Nations communities. And it connects in with things like the Indigenous data sovereignty movement that's been growing in recent years. The idea that material about people, for example, information about Indigenous people should be managed and controlled by the people that information is about, rather than by kind of other groups or other organizations. At a community level, I kind of refer back to that initial map that I showed and the number of communities that exist across Australia. So there's no kind of uniform answer to this. It's not the same across all of the communities. Different communities are at different stages of engaging with these ideas, and different communities will engage in different ways. There are some communities, for example, who are primarily interested in being able to access the knowledge and material that they need. The idea that it sits in archives or museums at the moment is not necessarily a problem, provided it's visible and can be accessed when needed, and provided that appropriate kind of cultural protocols exist around that material, so that people who shouldn't view that material can't view that material. For example, if there's knowledge in collections that is men's business or women's business, so it should only be viewed by men or should only be viewed by women, that increasingly is built into the way institutions work, as well as the way that communities work, so that you have spaces in an institutional store around collections material or around archives where only male staff members are able to go because of the cultural protocols that sit around that. There are also examples from the kind of COVID era where Indigenous staff were allowed to go into institutions despite the restrictions that existed during COVID, because there was a living connection with the material and the artifacts needed people around them and needed those sort of interactions, because the artifacts and the material in the collections, these are beings in their own right, and they need that kind of relational connection to remain kind of active or living or available, so they can't be kind of abandoned in a museum store. The other end of that are communities that are building their own databases. They're building their own archives. They've got funding for museum spaces and for collecting, often not large amounts of funding, but enough to start building collections themselves. They want to manage things using their own standards and protocols, using their own language, using their own sort of symbols, and are starting to take back that control in a much more kind of foundational way, essentially moving this material back onto country, back onto the landscape at a community level. So there's a big kind of cross-section at the moment with different communities at very different stages of development.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Well, if anyone else wants to ask, comment, you're invited to do so. Or yeah, Luz?
Yes. Thank you so much for your presentation, Mike. And I think a big question, I don't know. I think that your proposal helping us to think how we can change the paradigms
Yeah.
about the research in general, not only for archivists and librarians, if not for the scientists in general, because they are a lot of point of view about the nature and universe from indigenous people. And also, I think that to understand the archives with different type of materials, nos obliga, how can I say it?
It applies.
To us, yes, to invite us to work with a lot of other disciplines. And I think that my question is about how we can think about the change of discipline or the research in general from this perspective, and how we can think to think it in a large scale. I think that is, thank you for your presentation. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that if I understand your question, in terms of how we kind of step outside those disciplinary boundaries and work more effectively across the boundaries that exist and connect up across the boundaries that exist in useful kind of ways. And I think there's kind of multiple parts to that. I feel like archives are one of the professions, and there were several professions like this that, particularly in the 20th century, went through a period of sort of defining itself and defining itself by separating itself off from other things. It was archivists sort of stepping up and saying, we're not like library staff, we're not like museum staff, we manage things in different ways, we think about the world in different ways. We use ideas like original order and respect de fond and provenance and these sort of things to manage material in ways that's quite distinct from these other areas. Therefore, we need to separate ourselves off to do that. I think the profession, I would hope, has reached a level of maturity now where we don't need to kind of patrol the boundaries of the profession in quite the same way. Of course, there's a strong kind of identity there that I don't think is lost by working effectively and more collaboratively with other people in other sorts of ways. And I think there's also a technological answer to this where to my mind, many of the systems and approaches and ways that we work in things like the archival profession are still based on what we needed to do when we were physically managing material and listing it in a single document or a register or something like that. Something had to exist in a single context and we had to manage it in that context. So archivists pulled archival material out from other contexts, separated it off and said, we're managing this in an archival context because that's what we need to do. But we're now at the stage where, particularly kind of in the technological world that we live in, where things can be managed in multiple contexts at the same time, particularly intellectually. So connecting something into a museum collection database or into another disciplinary area and showing the links between those things doesn't mean that we throw out archival hierarchies and archival description and archival standards or any of those things that have been worked on for a few generations now. We can keep all of those things, but also show that these things exist in another context as well. So a Donald Thompson field book, to use that example that I was talking about, that exists in an archival hierarchy, but it also has lateral relationships that cross boundaries into other parts of the collection. It's related to a thing that sits in natural sciences and a thing that sits in the artifact collection and a publication that's in the library and all those other elements. And I do think that the documentation structures are a way that we can start to move across those boundaries so that even if we continue to maintain some of those divisions professionally for quite particular reasons, the users of our collections, whether they're other researchers or community members or people just wanting to explore and navigate this material, they don't get stopped by the barriers that exist between our professions. They can move across them in a much more a much easier way, stepping across those sorts of boundaries. But also, just quickly, and I won't talk for too long, but I think the other thing that needs to happen is for archivists in particular, I've said this in many other contexts, but archivists to continue to step outside of their professional spaces and talk more to other people about what they do and the value of the work that we do. So, you know, archivists not just speaking to other archivists as part of archival seminars and conferences and things like that, but archivists also going to museum conferences, going to library conferences, going to data management conferences, going to all these other kind of disciplinary spaces where we think what we do has some value to add into those spaces, and starting to talk about how we can work together to achieve the things that we want to achieve. So I think it's the short version, moving away from kind of patrolling the boundaries and thinking we need to protect our profession by not letting things cross the boundaries, to working in ways that cross those boundaries all the time, but still maintaining the core of what we do as archivists in a kind of useful way. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I see that Josep Simon has raised his hand. If you want to ask, go ahead.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
I saw you also mentioned some questions of organization or logistics, such as the risks of separating the archive from the museum, that might lead to further decontextualization in the description of objects, for instance, and you also introduced briefly some examples of softwares, the use of webs, etc. So I was wondering if you could say something more about the role of technology, because I guess every technology has an embedded philosophy and might help to further collaboration or make things more democratic or more autocratic. I don't know what you think about this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm going to start by extending an example that I talked about, and then link it to the technology question, because to give an example from the Melbourne Museum and the different sorts of archives that I talk about, to think about this kind of split. Field notebooks, so the sort of notebooks that natural sciences people and anthropologists and others keep in those professions, the way that they're stored and managed at somewhere like the Melbourne Museum in Melbourne, where I live and work, is that the material that's a field notebook that's written by a staff member is kept in the institutional archive, and a field notebook that's written by an anthropologist that donated artifacts to the collection is kept in the collections archive. And that means it's kind of kept alongside the collection. That means that they use two different systems at that museum. So the institutional archive is in HP Content Manager, or TRIM, as it used to be known, and the collections database is in KEMU. So these things are documented in different systems, and the systems don't talk to each other properly. When a curator wants to work with a field notebook as part of their collections work, what has happened in some cases in the past is that they've deaccessioned the field notebook from the archive, removed it from that database, transferred it both physically and intellectually across into the collection space, and registered it in EMU as a collections item. And they've done that instead of creating a link from one database into the other database, because it's kind of technologically difficult to do that. But the other reason they've done that, apart from the technology barrier, is because of the way that people think in that institution. They think the stuff that sits in my store is the stuff I'm responsible for. And if I want to use that as part of my work and it's related to it, I want to be physically and intellectually responsible for it, as well as having access to it to do the work that I want to do. And I think my reading of this, having studied this for a while, is that the systems and technologies that are created to support institutions they arise out of the institutions themselves. So these companies don't create these sort of systems and impose them on institutions and shut down the way the institution works. Something like EMU was developed from an institutional level by institutions saying, this is what we need and this is how we want to manage our stuff. And at that stage, they didn't talk about archives, really. They talked about their collections material and how they wanted to manage all of that. So I think in terms of overcoming some of those technological barriers, it doesn't start with the technology. It starts with the way people think about their collections and the material that they work with. And then that thinking needs to get translated into technological change that supports that new way of thinking about material. And these systems are continually being kind of developed and changed. Big vendors like Arxius and others, if people start asking for new functionality or will pay for new functionality, they'll develop that new functionality. And sometimes they'll develop it at a price, but if lots of people are asking for it, they might release it as part of the next part of their system. I think changing the thinking of people about how they conceptualize these things and getting documentation and technologies to reflect that thinking is the way to go, rather than thinking, let's change the databases and expect people to work differently. And the other point that I'd say on that is that I think there's lots of evidence for that, because a lot of people don't use the databases that they've got to do as much as they possibly could to go further down this track. They're not hitting the boundaries of the possibilities of the systems that they're using. They're still working in ways that they used to work. And there's an example of that with the Donald Thompson collection at the Melbourne Museum, where they used to have different databases for different disciplines, across different disciplines. And there used to be entirely separate databases with their own authority structure and things like that. So Donald Thompson had his own record in an ornithology database because he collected birds, and in a botanical database because he collected botanical specimens, and his own authority record in an anthropological database, and another database, and another database. If you look in KE-EMU today in the Melbourne Museum, there are something like 16 authority records for Donald Thompson still in that collections database, because no one has done the work of consolidating them into a single one to start to bring that together across those boundaries. You could do that work. The database lets you do it. It's not a technological barrier. It's the fact that the ornithologists still think of that as, say, well, I've got the ornithological record for Thompson and that's what I need for my work. And someone else says, well, I've got the ichthyologist record because I deal with fish, and so I've got the one that I need. And no one's actually looked at the overall structure and said, well, if we consolidate this, we can start to do different things with it in a more useful way. So it's changing thinking. It's applying that thinking to the existing systems and pushing those systems as far as we can possibly go. And when you start hitting the barriers of those systems, that's when you start talking to vendors and saying, this is what we need next so that we can take the next step. And it'll take a generation or something to achieve it, but I think it needs to start happening.
Okay, thank you very much. Interesting.
Thank you for the question.
Okay, more questions or comments en el chat.
¿Tienen preguntas?
No, pero que queda del comenzamiento.
Sí, Francesca tiene una pregunta.
Okay, Francesca, so will you come? Yeah, I think it's the best thing.
Siéntate acá. Toma.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi. Thank you for your beautiful presentation. I'm not an expert at all of the topic, so I don't know if the question makes sense, but I was wondering if all these debates on museum objects, and in particular on the restitution of the objects, also apply, for example, to plants. Because I was thinking about all this herbarium that we see in European museums from the early modern times and after as well. And many times those are plants that have been taken during expeditions and later also in the context of colonialism. So I was just curious to know if this kind of debate of the revendication also apply to other kinds of museums objects. And also another another curiosity is that where museum put the tag. I was wondering when I was looking at your presentation, I saw some labels, some paper tags to the objects. So I was wondering if this kind of paper technology goes to the archive, the museum archive, or more, I don't know, in another space in between the object and the paperwork. Thank you.
So those are the handwritten tags on objects and specimens and things like that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Both interesting questions. And the one about plants is really interesting. I don't know myself of any examples of requests for kind of repatriation or return of plants and botanical specimens specifically. There is one of the things about, for example, stone tools that I mentioned. There are conversations about stone tools being returned, and in some ways it's not just because of their function as cultural objects, but it's because they are country. It's the land, it's the geology, it's the rocks, it's the material of country that has been taken away from country and put in a different place. So there are certainly kind of extensions of the idea of repatriation and return that extend into those areas of trying to get parts of country back that have been removed from country. And the other interesting thing with kind of herbaria and botanical specimens is that in some cases they're collected because of their relationship to cultural artifacts and objects, as well as botanical specimens in their own right. So again, Donald Thompson, whose stuff I know better than most, he collected many botanical specimens, and I mentioned a cross-reference to botanical specimens in one of the catalogs that I referenced for him. And he collected them in part because those were the raw materials that went into making things like the harpoon rope and the wooden harpoons. So the rope is made from hibiscus fiber from a hibiscus plant that's up on the Cape York Peninsula. And he collected samples of that plant before it was turned into the string and woven into the rope, as well as the finished ropes, as well as documenting the process. And many of those specimens ended up in the Queensland Herbarium rather than in the museum. So there's actually a separate collection of Thompson botanical specimens that sits up there. Another example of kind of separation across institutional boundaries based on collection type, despite the fact that the reason he collected it was because of its close association with the artifacts he was collecting. But I don't know of any examples of people requesting that back. But now I want to go and have a look and see if I can find any, because I think it's a really good question. And with the handwritten tags, I mean, in many cases, and we saw one with the dugong skull that I showed, a lot of those tags remain attached to the objects and are left kind of in situ. Where they're not, they're quite often, in examples that I've seen, kept in the box with the item. If the item is sort of separately boxed or in drawers, for example, the tags are left with them. There's an interesting area of preventative conservation that I've written about before that I won't go into in detail, but kind of talks about the idea of dissociation and making sure that collection items don't end up dissociated or separated from the knowledge about them. But the knowledge about them in a lot of that conversation is the knowledge that's on tags. That's kind of the metadata. It's the basic information about who found this, where it was found, and the date that they found it, for example, and doesn't necessarily extend to those broader kind of archival collections. So things like tags and specimen tags and artifact tags are often managed in really close physical and intellectual relationship with objects and artifacts. And it's the other material that's the kind of next step out that gets separated out into archives and other spaces, at least as far as I've seen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I would also like, when I was hearing at your reference to this disciplinary boundary, I was thinking that this, when we think, for instance, in the history of molecular biology, you see also this idea of how at some period in the 1960s, it came into a discipline, it closed in itself and so on. And then there are many authors that reflecting on how it has evolved, saying that it went beyond the discipline to a kind of ultra discipline, and that's, I guess, is possible when you are a highly consolidated and well recognized discipline, then going to this kind of more interdisciplinary approach. And I guess that with archives, with archives, it can happen to some archivists. Could happen to some point this. So, and then I wanted to ask you, because you were referring, well, we were talking disciplines. It's about also technology, about the classifications, and also institutions appear there, no? And I guess the institutions are defined by the disciplines, but also by many political authorities, or by the economic sector also. So I don't know if that would be another issue on how institutions are defined, and how this stands as a problem in order to have this crossroads you were talking about. I don't know if there's some kind of action at that level of the institution, the definition of the institution, of the museum, of the library, of the archive.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and one of the despite me talking about linking things up and kind of relationships, and there was a big movement from the kind of 80s and 90s in particular of this idea of convergence, this idea of bringing particularly libraries, archives, and museums together, of consolidating functions, consolidating collections, consolidating sort of back of house staff and ways of working, trying to create kind of seamless collections for users, so that users didn't know whether they were in an archive or a library or a gallery, for example. And there was a lot of pushback from a lot of people across the sector to this kind of convergence, and people continue to push back against it. I mean, in Australia, there are many examples of proposals, some successful, some unsuccessful, to combine a state archive, for example, with a state library. And politicians and economists and others saying we should bring these two things together and put them under the same roof, and they can share back of house staff and share facilities, and the archival community tends to push back on these things very hard for all sorts of reasons. And the pushback quite often comes from the archivists, I think, in those spaces, because archivists still have a concern about being kind of subsumed by a bigger structure, by a more dominant discipline, a more long-standing and a more publicly recognized discipline. So I think archivists possibly push back sometimes harder than others do. And it's also because of the function at that kind of political level of archives, not just as research material and as historical research material, which is mostly what I've been talking about today, but it's also that other function of archives as evidence of government action, as supporting accountability, of supporting freedom of information and transparency and the public right to know about government activities, and being able to support inquiries and claims for redress and those other sorts of elements. And I think there's quite a kind of justifiable fear sometimes that if archives get subsumed into something like a library structure that doesn't fully understand or appreciate the value of the archive as evidence as well as reference material and research material in that kind of way, then some of that kind of function of the archive could be lost in problematic ways with problematic impacts. And there's the usual concerns about loss of funding, loss of staff, loss of numbers of people working in the profession, a kind of downskilling of people, or having only semi-skilled staff working in spaces rather than full professionals, and all those elements. So yes, I think there are some really complicated other issues that come into this space in terms of trying to either bring things together or keep things separate.
Okay, we are already getting to the end of this seminar. I don't know if someone else wants to comment or question or raise any question.
Yo creo que está
¿Ya
bien, ¿no?
está?
Sí.
¿En qué?
Sí.
¿Tú o yo?
No, como tú quieras.
Okay, then if there are no more questions, I just want to thank you, Mike, for this talk and for all your answers. I think that, as I said, I think that you raised many very interesting points, and on a topic that we are now starting to work on, but we will continue to work on it. So if it's fine for you, it will be great to keep in touch and keep sharing this project.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and best of luck for the rest of the seminars and the workshop in January. I hope it goes really well. Please do keep in touch. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.